The stagecoach left her at the edge of Cottonwood Bend with a worn carpetbag, a saddle balanced across her hip, and a folded letter pressed flat against her ribs beneath her bodice. The driver did not climb down to help. He flicked the reins and the horses pulled away, and the dust they raised settled slowly across the toes of her boots while she stood in the middle of the road and tried to remember how to breathe. The town did not look at her. That was not quite true. The town looked at her the way a town looks at a stray dog, measuring whether it might bite, whether it might be diseased, whether it would be a kindness or a foolishness to feed it. A woman in a black dress, with a saddle on her hip, was not a thing. Cottonwood Bend had seen before. Theda Marsh let the looking happen. She had been looked at worse. She shifted the saddle. It was a McClellan, cut down and re-rigged for a woman's seat, and the leather had been oiled so many times it had gone the color of strong tea. It had been her husband's first, and then it had been hers, and now it was the only thing in the world she owned that mattered. The letter in her bodice was the second thing. The carpetbag held everything else, which was almost nothing. She asked a boy chewing licorice where the Callaway ranch lay. He pointed west and said 3 miles. And then he said it like a question, like he could not believe a woman with a saddle would walk 3 miles in this heat with no horse under her. She thanked him. She walked. The road took her past a creek bed gone to cracked clay, and past a stand of cottonwoods whose leaves clattered in the dry wind like coins in a tin. She did not stop. She had walked further with less, in worse company than her own. When the ranch gate came into view, she set the saddle down for the first time and stood looking at it. The crossbar above the gate read, "Crud, Callaway," in letters burned deep. Below it, smaller and newer, a brand had been carved, a half-moon laid over a bar. She knew that brand. She had drawn it once herself on the back of a feed receipt for her husband while he tried to remember which Kentucky line it traced from. Seeing it now, burnt into a rancher's gate 2,000 miles west of where she had drawn it, almost put her on her knees. She picked up the saddle and walked through the gate. The yard was orderly. That was the first thing she noticed. A man's yard tells you everything about him before he opens his mouth. The barn doors hung true on their hinges. The water trough was clean. The woodpile was stacked by length and dryness rather than thrown. A black gelding watched her from a paddock, with its ears forward and its weight already shifted to the off hind, which meant it was thinking about her, not just looking. She gave the gelding a nod the way she would have nodded to a man. "You're on private land," the voice came from behind her, low and unhurried. She turned slowly, because turning quickly with a saddle on your hip is a way to break a rib, and because she had learned a long time ago that men who spoke unhurried were the ones to watch carefully. He stood in the open door of the barn. Tall, broad through the shoulders without being heavy. Dust on his shirt and a streak of something dark across his forearm that might have been blood or might have been pitch. His hat was pushed back enough that she could see his eyes, and his eyes were the gray of weathered fence posts. Neither warm nor unkind, just used. He did not look surprised to find a strange woman in his yard. He looked like a man who had stopped being surprised by anything a long time ago. "I have a letter," she said. "For who? Mr. Callaway, you're looking at him." She set the saddle down on the rail of the nearest fence, lifted the letter out from beneath her bodice without ceremony or apology, and held it out. He crossed the yard, slowly, took it, and read it standing where he stood. His face did not change while he read. When he was done, he folded it again along the creases it already had and tapped it once against his palm. "Henry Marsh," he said. "My husband. He wrote me 3 years ago about a colt. I know. I wrote the letter for him." His hand had gone bad by then. Callaway looked at her for a long moment. The gelding in the paddock blew through its nose. Somewhere behind the barn a hammer fell once on iron and stopped. "He's passed. 2 months ago. I'm sorry to hear it. Thank you. There was no more grief in her voice than there was in his sympathy. They were both, she understood already, people who had buried what needed burying and walked on because the alternative was to lie down in the hole themselves. She liked him for the way he did not press. The letter says you're here about work. It says I know horses. Same thing on this place. Then, yes, I'm here about work. He looked her over once openly, the way he would have looked over a horse offered for sale. Not lewd, not appraising in a way that made her skin crawl, but measuring the soundness of what stood in front of him. She let him look. She knew what he saw, a woman of 34, in a dress that had been black once, and was now the color of rode hands, that were not soft, a mouth that did not smile easily. The saddle on the fence rail behind her. You ride that? I rode it here from Missouri over 3 months. I rode it before that for 9 years. Side saddle, astride, under a long skirt when there were folks watching, not when there weren't. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth that might have been the ghost of a smile if it had been allowed to finish. It was not. I don't hire women. Your letter says you needed someone who knew the Crabbit line. I doubt the men you didn't hire knew what Crabbit was. He went still. It was the kind of stillness that came over the gelding in the paddock when something interesting moved in the brush. Not alarm, just full attention. Say that again. Your stallion. The one in the back pasture I haven't seen yet. He's out of a Crabbit mare by way of the Davenport import that came through New Orleans in '64. Your letter to Henry asked about a colt to cross on him. Henry wrote back and told you to find a half-Morgan mare, with a deep heart girth and a quiet eye. Not the racing-bred filly the Tennessee man was trying to sell you. I wrote that letter. I know what's in your pasture, because I know what you asked for, and I know what Henry told you. Holt Callaway looked at her. The barn behind him creaked in the wind. The gelding shifted its weight to the other hind leg. Far off a crow called once, and was answered. What's your name? Theta Marsh. Mrs. Marsh, you can put your saddle in the tack room and your bag in the room off the kitchen. We'll talk about the rest after supper. He turned and walked back into the barn without waiting to see if she would follow. She picked up the saddle and the carpet bag and went where he had pointed. The room off the kitchen was small and clean and smelled of lye and pine. A narrow bed, a washstand, a hook on the back of the door, a window that looked out on the kitchen garden. She set the carpet bag on the bed and the saddle on the floor at the foot of it because there was no rack, and she would not lean good leather against a wall to warp. She stood for a moment with her hands flat on the footrail of the bed and let herself feel, for the first time since the stage had pulled away, that she was not standing in the road. Then she went to find the kitchen and see what needed doing. A woman was already there. Older, gray-haired, sleeves rolled to the elbow, kneading dough on a board that had been used for kneading dough so many years it had a hollow, worn into the middle. She did not look up. You'd be the widow. I would. I'm Maud. I cook here and I keep the books here, and I don't take to being underfoot in my own kitchen. I won't be. You can peel those potatoes if your hands are idle. Theta peeled the potatoes. They worked side by side in silence for an hour, and the silence was not unfriendly. When the potatoes were in the pot and the bread was rising under a cloth, Maud wiped her hands on her apron and looked at her properly, for the first time. You'll want to know what you walked into. I'll listen. He lost his wife 4 years back, lost the baby with her. He has not said either of their names since the day they went into the ground. He runs this place hard, and he runs himself harder, and the only thing left in him that he treats gentle is the horses. You came here with a letter from a horseman he respected. That is the only reason you are standing in my kitchen and not walking back to town. Do not waste it. I won't. Maud nodded once and went back to her work. Supper was venison stew and bread and coffee, black enough to lean a spoon against. 3 men ate at the long table. Callaway, a foreman named Sullivan, with a face like a hatchet, and a younger hand called Dutch, who could not have been 20, and who stared openly at Theta, for the whole first half of the meal, until Sullivan kicked him under the table. She ate quietly, and answered when asked, and did not ask anything in return. After supper, Callaway pushed his plate away and looked at her down the length of the table. "You'll come look at the stallion in the morning. If you see what you said, you'd see you have work here through the foaling season, room, board, and a wage I'll name, once I know what you're worth. If you don't, I'll drive you back to town myself, fair. One thing more. I don't know what brought you out here alone with a dead husband's saddle on your hip, and I don't need to know, unless you want me to, but this is a working ranch. If trouble follows you, I'd as soon hear it now." She held his eyes across the table. Sullivan had gone still. Dutch had stopped chewing. "No trouble follows me, Mr. Callaway. There is no one left who cared enough about me to follow." He nodded once, slowly, and the matter was closed. She lay awake a long time that first night. The bed was narrow and the mattress was straw, and the window was open a crack to let in the night air, and through it she could hear the small sounds of a ranch settling. A horse shifting in its stall, a dog turning twice on a porch board, the long, slow creak of timber cooling after a hot day. She had not slept somewhere this quiet in 5 years. The quiet kept her awake, the way noise would have kept other women awake. She thought of Henry, who had taught her every Kentucky bloodline he knew, and who had said before he died that she should take the saddle and the letter and go west. Because the West was a place where what you knew mattered more than what you had been. She thought of Henry's brother, who had arrived at the farm 3 weeks after the funeral, and informed her that the place was his, now under a will she had never seen, and that she could stay if she wished as his housekeeper, and that he would expect her to keep his bed warm as well as his kitchen. She had taken the saddle and the letter and gone west. She slept eventually. She dreamed of nothing. The stallion was in the back pasture, and he was magnificent. She saw that the moment Callaway opened the gate for her. 16 hands. Dark bay, deep through the chest, with the kind of clean legs that come down a line and not from a single lucky cross. He lifted his head when he saw them and stood watching with the still considering quality of an animal who had decided long ago that men were a thing to be tolerated and not feared. "Don't go in there alone," Callaway said behind her. "I wasn't planning to." She set her elbows on the top rail and let the stallion look at her. He took his time. After a long while he walked over, not in a hurry, and stopped 6 feet from the fence and dropped his head to crop at a clump of grass. He did not look at her again. He had decided she was furniture, and that was a compliment. "His sire was Bashir," she said quietly, "out of a mare called Honey Dust. Bashir threw 3 colts that lived, and this is the middle one. The first one died of colic at 4. The third one is in Virginia, and they call him King Solomon, and he stands at $60 a cover. This one's better." Callaway did not answer. She could feel him beside her, very still. "He's better, because Bashir's weakness was a short hip, and Honey Dust's weakness was a soft pastern, and somehow this colt got the long hip from his damn side and the deep pasterns from her grandsire. You won't get this combination again from this cross. If you breed him to the wrong mare, you will lose what makes him what he is, in 1 generation. Henry told you what to look for. Did you find her?" "I found 3. None of them are the right one. Show them to me." He showed her. They walked out to the broodmare pasture, and she went among them without hurry, putting a hand on a shoulder here and a flank there, lifting a foot, looking at the way a head was set on a neck, the way an eye sat in a skull. 2 of the mares were sound but ordinary. The third one was beautiful and would breed back something worse than herself. Theda told him so. "The mare you want is not here yet. You'll find her in a Mormon settlement north of here or out of a Mexican line on the Pecos. You want a half Morgan with desert blood somewhere in the damn side. And a quiet eye. Quiet eye is everything. Bashir's get can go hot. You want to bring them down, not stack heat on heat." He was looking at her now, Not at the mares, at her. Henry told me to listen to whatever you said about a horse, because you had the eye better than he did. He was being accurate. The corner of his mouth did the thing again. This time it was almost a smile. You have work here, Mrs. Marsh, through foaling. Past it if the work suits us both. It will suit me. We'll see if it suits me. He walked back toward the house, and she stayed at the pasture rail another half-hour, watching the stallion graze and feeling something in her chest that she had not let herself feel in a very long time. It was not happiness. It was the absence of dread. She had forgotten how much the absence of dread weighed. The weeks that followed taught her the shape of the ranch. There were 9 men who worked it under Sullivan, and they treated her at first the way men treat a tool whose use they have not yet figured out. Dutch was friendly because Dutch was friendly to everything that breathed. Sullivan was reserved but fair. The others ranged from indifferent to mildly hostile, and one of them, a square-built man named Rowe, who worked the South Range, looked at her in a way she did not like and did not forget. She made herself useful in ways they could not argue with. She trimmed feed on the yearlings that had not been handled, because the men were busy with calving and the colts had grown ranker than they should have. She rebuilt the foaling kit in the barn, which had been put together by someone who had never foaled out a mare in earnest. She taught Dutch how to read the 3rd trimester signs in a bag, which Dutch took to with the seriousness of a boy who had never been taught anything by a woman in his life and who turned out to be hungry to learn. She did not see much of Callaway in those first weeks. He rode out before dawn and came back after dark, and he ate his supper quickly and went to the small room he used as an office and stayed there until the lamp went out. Maud told her without being asked that he had not done it that way before his wife died. He had been a man who lingered at the table and told stories. Now he was a man who worked. The first time he came to find her on purpose was the night the chestnut mare went into labor early. Theda was already in the barn. She had been watching the mare for 2 days, and she had known by sundown that the foal would come that night and come too soon. She had her sleeves rolled and the foaling kit laid out and a lantern hung from the post when she heard his boots on the boards. Sullivan said you were here. She's 3 weeks early. The foal is small and the presentation isn't right. I'm going to have to go in. Do you need me to send for the vet? The vet is half a day's ride. The foal won't wait. Stay if you want to help. Go if you don't want to watch. He stayed. He held the mare's halter and spoke to her in a low voice while Theda worked, and Theda worked in silence, with her arm in past the elbow, finding a hock where a forefoot should have been, easing it back, finding the missing foot, drawing it forward. The mare groaned and shuddered. Callaway's voice did not change pitch. Theda's hands did not shake. The foal came out small and slick and not breathing. Theda cleared its nose and rubbed it down hard with sacking, and for a long minute nothing happened, and then the rib cage twitched, and the foal drew a breath that turned into a cough, that turned into a wet, indignant cry. The mare turned her head and made the low maternal nicker that no one who has ever heard it forgets. Theda sat back on her heels in the straw and wiped her arm on her apron and realized her hands were shaking now. They always shook after, never during. Callaway was looking at her across the foal. The lantern made his face into something younger than it had been in daylight. You saved that foal. She saved the foal. I just got him pointed the right way. You saved that foal, Mrs. Marsh. She did not argue with him again. She got up and washed her arms in the bucket and watched the colt find his feet for the first time. All knees and ankles and stubborn small will, and she felt Callaway watching her watch the colt, and she did not turn her head. He walked her back to the house when it was done. The night was cold and there was a moon that turned the yard silver. At the kitchen door, he stopped and took off his hat for the first time in her presence. Good night, Theda. It was the first time he had said her name. It came out of his mouth different than her name had ever sounded in another mouth. Quieter, like a thing handled carefully because it might break. Good night, Mr. Callaway, Holt. Good night, Holt. She went inside before her face could do anything she did not want him to see. Spring came on the prairie the way it always did, in fits and false starts, and the work doubled and then doubled again. 4 more foals dropped, all of them living, and Theta was there for everyone. She slept in 3-hour stretches in the foaling barn and ate standing up, and her hands were never entirely clean. She had not been so tired or so content in 9 years. Holt brought her coffee one morning before dawn, set the mug down on the rail beside her without speaking, and walked back to the house. He did it the next morning, and the next. By the 4th morning, Maud was sending the coffee out with him, and a slice of bread besides, and Maud was making a particular face when she sent it that Theta chose not to interpret. He started staying for supper at the table again. He did not tell stories the way Maud had said he used to, but he sat and he listened, and once he laughed, short, surprised, almost annoyed at himself, at something Dutch said, and the men at the table looked at each other and then looked away, and did not comment because comment would have broken it. He found her in the tack room one evening when she was conditioning her saddle. He stood in the doorway watching her work, the oil into the skirts with her palms. That's a fine piece of leather. It was Henry's first. He bought it off a cavalry quartermaster. After the war, it's been re-rigged twice. Tell me about him. She did not look up. She kept her hands moving on the leather. He was 40 when he married me. I was 23. He taught me everything I know about horses, and most of what I know about people. He never raised his voice, and he never lied to me, and he never made me feel small for being a woman who could ride better than most men. He was sick the last 2 years. He knew he was going. He spent the last 6 months teaching me everything he had not yet had time to teach. And after, his brother arrived with a will I had not seen. The will gave him the farm and the stock and everything Henry and I had built. The will did not mention me. His brother offered me a position in his household which I did not accept. I took the saddle and the letter, and I left in the night. Was the will real? She did look up then. She set the rag down on the bench and met his eye. I do not know. Henry never spoke of it to me. The signature looked like his. The witnesses were men I had never heard of. I had no money to fight it, and no kin to help me, and no will of my own to set against it. I left, because staying was going to cost me more than leaving. He was quiet for a long time. The lantern hissed softly on its hook. If you wanted to write a letter east, I have a lawyer in St. Louis who owes me a favor. Holt, you think on it. I'll think on it. He nodded, and turned to go, and at the doorway he stopped, his hand on the jamb, and spoke without turning around. I'm glad you came. He was gone before she could answer. She sat for a long while with her hands on the saddle, and the lantern hissing, and her chest doing something complicated and warm. She did not let herself cry. She had not cried since the night she left Missouri, and she was not going to start now in another man's tack room. The man named Roe was the first sign of what was coming. She caught him in the foaling barn on a morning when she was not supposed to be there. He had the new colt in a corner and a coiled length of cotton rope in his hand, and the colt had its ears pinned and its weight back, and Roe had the slow, ugly grin of a man who liked to break things that could not fight him properly. Step out of the stall. He looked up at her. The grin did not change. The boss said the colt needed handling. He needed handling, not breaking. Step out of the stall. And if I don't, she did not raise her voice. She had not raised her voice in 9 years. Then I will tell the boss what I walked in on. And then I will tell him about the bottle in your saddlebag that I have smelled on your breath 3 mornings this week. And then I will tell him about the way you look at me when you think no one is watching. Step out of the stall, Mr. Roe. He stepped out of the stall. He brushed past her, closer than he needed to, and the smell of him, whiskey and old sweat and something under it, she did not have a name for, stayed in the barn after he was gone. She stood with her hand on the colt's neck and waited until her breathing was even again. She did not tell Holt that day. She told him 3 days later, When Roe rode into the yard with a bruise on his cheekbone, he had not had at breakfast, and a story about a horse that had thrown him that did not match the dust on his shirt. She told Holt in the tack room after supper, calmly and in order, every piece of it. Holt listened without speaking. When she was done, he stood up and walked out of the barn and across the yard and into the bunkhouse. And she heard his voice through the open window, low and short, and then she heard Roe's voice, rise, and then she heard Holt's voice drop to something she had never heard in it before. Roe rode out within the hour. He took his saddle and his bedroll, and the bottle, and nothing else. Holt watched him to the gate and stayed at the gate until the dust had settled. He came to find her after. She was at the pasture rail watching the stallion in the last of the light. "He's gone. He won't be back. Thank you. You should have told me the morning it happened. I wasn't sure yet that you would believe me over a man who had worked here 3 years." He went still. She had not meant to wound him with that, and she saw at once that she had. "Theda, I am sorry. I should not have said it that way. I am not used to. You are not used to being believed." "No." He turned to face her. They were closer than she had realized. The light was almost gone, and his eyes were dark, and his hand came up slowly and took hers off the rail and held it between them. His palm was warm and rough, and shook very slightly, which she did not think he knew. "I believe you. I will always believe you. About a horse, about a man, about yourself. Do you hear me?" "I hear you." He let her hand go, before he had to. He stepped back and put his hat on and walked back to the house, and she stayed at the rail with her hand still warm where his had held it. She did not sleep that night either. The trouble that followed her had not followed her after all. It arrived 3 weeks later, on its own, by stagecoach, in the person of a thin man in a black suit, with a leather case, and a letter from a court in Missouri, and an expression of polite official regret. His name was Mr. Vale, and he was, he explained, a representative of the estate of Henry Marsh, and he had been engaged by the deceased's brother to locate a certain Theda Marsh widow who had departed the farm without leave and who was, he was sorry to inform her, named in a civil complaint regarding the disappearance of certain items of value from the estate. He said this on the front porch of Holt Callaway's house, with Holt standing behind her, and Maud standing behind Holt, and Sullivan standing at the foot of the porch steps, with his thumbs in his belt. "What items?" "A saddle, Mrs. Marsh. Cavalry pattern, re-rigged, appraised value $60, and a quantity of personal correspondence belonging to the deceased. The saddle was a gift from my husband. The correspondence was written by me on his behalf and in his hand for the latter portion of his illness. That is a matter for the court to determine, is it? I am authorized to take you into custody pending." "No, you ain't." Holt did not raise his voice. He stepped forward and put himself between Theda and the man in the black suit, and he said it quietly, the way he said everything, "Show me your warrant." Mr. Vale produced a paper. Holt read it. He read it twice. He handed it back. "This is a civil complaint, not a criminal warrant. You have no authority to take her anywhere. You are welcome to ride back to town and wire your employer that she will answer the complaint through counsel, my counsel, in St. Louis, whose name I will provide. Until that lawyer tells me otherwise, this woman is under my roof and she will stay under my roof. And if you set foot on my land again without a proper warrant signed by a federal judge, I will treat you as a trespasser, and so will every man who works for me. Do you understand me?" Mr. Vale understood him. Mr. Vale tipped his hat with a thin, professional smile and walked back to the buggy he had come in and drove away. Holt turned around and looked at her. His face was set in a way she had not seen before. It was the face, she realized, of a man who had been waiting 4 years for something to fight for. "Inside, both of you, we have letters to write." They wrote letters. They wrote one to the lawyer, in St. Louis, and one to a circuit judge Holt knew personally, and one at Theda's insistence to a neighbor of Henry's farm, an old woman named Eulalia Banks, who had been Henry's mother's closest friend, and who had been at the farm the week Henry died, and who, if anyone living could swear to what Henry's true wishes had been, was the one. Eulalia Banks wrote back 6 weeks later. Her letter was 3 pages long, and written in a hand that wandered across the page like an old creek finding its way to a river. She wrote that Henry had told her, the week before he died, that he had drawn up a new will, leaving everything to Theta, and had given a copy to the lawyer in town. She wrote that the lawyer in town had died of fever the spring after Henry. She wrote that Henry's brother had arrived at the lawyer's office the day after the lawyer's funeral and had been seen leaving with a satchel of papers. She wrote that she had not told Theta any of this at the funeral because she had been afraid the brother would hurt her if she did, and she had assumed Theta would simply marry someone else, and she was old and ashamed, and writing now to say that the old will the brother had produced was a forgery, and she would swear to it in any court that would have her. Theta read the letter sitting at the kitchen table. Maud was on one side of her, and Holt was on the other. When she was done, she folded the letter very precisely and set it down on the wood, and put both her hands flat on either side of it, and bent her head, and cried for the first time in a year and a half. Holt did not touch her. He sat beside her and let her cry, and when she was done, he handed her his handkerchief, without comment, and got up and went to his office, and came back 20 minutes later with a folded paper of his own. I wired St. Mact. Lewis this morning before you came down. The lawyer has filed on your behalf. The brother has 30 days to answer or default. With Eulalia's letter, he will not answer. The farm will revert. Holt, it is your farm, Theta. It always was. She looked at him across the table. She thought about the farm. She thought about Henry's grave under the elm. She thought about the kitchen, where she had cooked 9 years of meals, and the porch where she had sat with him the evening before he died, and the stretch of pasture where she had taught herself to ride astride after he was too sick to ride with her. I don't want it, Theta. I want the brother out of it. I want him punished for what he tried to do. But I do not want to go back there. Henry is buried there, but Henry is not there. I want— She stopped. She could not say what she wanted. She looked down at her hands. Maud got up and went to the stove and made a great deal of noise about the coffee pot, which was her way of leaving a room without leaving it. Holt reached across the table and took Theta's hand. He held it the way he had held it at the pasture rail, but this time he did not let it go. Sell it. Sell it to the neighbor who has wanted that creek bottom for 10 years. Take the money. Put it in the bank in town in your own name, and stay. Stay as what? Holt. He did not answer right away. He looked at their hands on the table. He looked back up at her. Stay as whatever you want to be. Stay as the woman who runs my breeding program. Stay as the woman who eats at my table. Stay as the woman who I have not stopped thinking about since the morning I watched you put your hand on that stallion's neck and tell him your name without speaking it out loud. Stay, any way you want to. Stay, but stay. She did not say anything for a long moment. She turned her hand over, under his, and laced her fingers through his fingers, which were rough and warm and trembling, very slightly, the way they had trembled at the rail, and she lifted his hand and pressed the back of it to her cheek and held it there. I'll stay. He closed his eyes. Maud at the stove made a noise that was not the coffee pot. They were married in the fall after the foals had been weaned, and the herd had been moved to winter pasture, and the brother in Missouri had defaulted on the suit, and the farm had been sold, and the money had gone into the bank in town under the name Theta Marsh, which Holt insisted on, because it was the name Henry had given her, and it was the name she had carried west, and it had earned its place. The wedding was in the front room of the ranch house. The preacher came out from town, and Maud wore a dress that had not been out of her trunk in 11 years, and Dutch wept openly through the entire ceremony, and Sullivan stood up as Holt's witness with his hatchet face arranged into the closest thing to a smile it knew how to make. Theda wore a dress the color of summer wheat that Maud had helped her sew. She did not wear black. She had buried her black dress in the bottom of the trunk in the room off the kitchen the morning she said yes, and she did not intend to take it out again. When the preacher asked if she would have this man, she said she would, and she meant it the way she had meant everything she had said since the day she stepped off the stagecoach at the edge of Cottonwood Bend. When the preacher asked if Holt would have this woman, Holt said yes, before the preacher had finished the question, and the room laughed, and Holt did not flush or apologize. He looked at Theda the whole time. He did not look away once. That night, after the supper, and the dancing and the men riding home under a harvest moon, Theda walked out to the back pasture alone in her wedding dress, and stood at the rail and looked at the stallion in the moonlight. He came over to her the way he always did, and hurried and stood 6 feet from the fence and dropped his head to the grass. Holt came up behind her. He did not speak. He put his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on the top of her head, and she leaned back against him and closed her eyes and let the smell of him, clean shirt and wood smoke, and the faint particular smell of the leather he had been working that afternoon, settle into her. "I have been thinking about a name for the colt, have you, Henry?" She was quiet for a long moment. "Henry would have liked that. I thought he might." The stallion lifted his head and looked at them across the moonlit pasture, and the colt, half-grown now, leggy and dark and showing already the long hip from his grandsire, came up to stand beside his sire. And the two of them stood there together, looking back at the man and the woman at the fence, as if to say that everything in this place was where it was supposed to be. Theda put her hands over Holt's hands, where they rested at her waist. She felt his heartbeat against her back. She felt the saddle her husband had given her, sitting on its rack in the tack room behind the barn, oiled and clean and ready for the morning. She felt the weight of the letter from Eulalia Banks folded in the drawer of the desk in the office. She felt the ring on her finger that Holt had ordered from St. Louis and that had arrived 2 days before the wedding, and that he had put on her hand in front of God, and the preacher, and Maud, and Dutch, and Sullivan, and every man who worked the Callaway ranch, which was now also her ranch, because she had been given a place in this world and she had earned it. Holt, thank you for believing me. Thank you for telling me the truth. The wind moved across the pasture. The cottonwoods at the far end clattered their dry leaves. Somewhere in the night, a coyote called, and was answered by another, and the stallion flicked one ear toward the sound and decided it was not his problem. They stayed at the rail a long time. Eventually, he turned her around and kissed her, and it was the first time he had kissed her, and it had been earned over a foaling barn, and a tack room, and a porch, and a kitchen table, and a hand held across the dinner board. And she kissed him back with her whole self, because there was no part of her left that was holding back. When they walked back to the house, his arm was around her shoulders, and her arm was around his waist, and the moon was high, and the yard was silver, and the barn doors hung true on their hinges, and the water trough was clean, and the woodpile was stacked by length and dryness. And the house at the end of the yard had a light on in the kitchen window, because Maud had left it lit for them, and a woman who had walked into Cottonwood Bend with a carpet-bag, and a saddle, and a folded letter against her ribs, walked home that night, to a porch that was hers. And a man who had not let himself be loved in 4 years went up the steps beside her, and held the door open and followed her inside, and the door closed behind them. And the prairie kept its own counsel in the dark, the way prairies do.